The thermometer outside Amos Caudle's cabin read 40 below zero on the morning of January 15, 1952. Inside, he sat comfortably in his wool shirt, feeding small pieces of split oak into a stone structure that looked nothing like any fireplace his neighbors had ever seen. 3 miles down the mountain, families huddled under every blanket they owned, burning furniture to stay alive, as their traditional fireplaces failed against the worst cold snap Appalachia had witnessed in recorded history. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten mountain wisdom move you, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's episode reveals an innovation even more unbelievable than this one. Henry Dalton died on February 9, 1951, in his cabin on Kettle Ridge. The fireplace was still burning when Amos Caudle found him 3 days later. Henry had been Amos's closest neighbor, living just 2 miles east through the laurel thickets that covered the steep Appalachian slopes of western North Carolina. They had helped each other with timber cutting, shared hunting territory, and traded supplies when the nearest town was a full day's walk through mountain passes that became impassable during heavy snow. Amos had grown concerned when he saw no smoke rising from Henry's chimney for 2 consecutive mornings. In mountain country, smoke meant life. Its absence meant trouble. He made the trek through knee-deep snow on the 3rd day, calling Henry's name as he approached the small log cabin that Henry had built 7 years earlier when he first claimed the land. The door was not barred. Amos pushed it open and immediately felt the cold. The fireplace held gray ashes and a few pieces of charred wood, evidence that a fire had burned recently, but the interior temperature was barely warmer than the air outside. Henry sat in his chair near the hearth, wrapped in 2 blankets, his body frozen solid. His face showed no signs of violence or sudden trauma. He had simply stopped moving at some point, overcome by cold, despite being less than 6 feet from his fireplace. Amos stood in that cabin for nearly an hour, trying to understand what he was seeing. The fireplace was well built, constructed from local fieldstone with a proper chimney that drew smoke efficiently. Split firewood was stacked against the wall, enough to last another month. Henry's axe leaned in the corner, sharp and ready for use. There was no shortage of fuel. There was no structural failure of the heating system. Yet Henry had frozen to death beside a fireplace that should have kept him alive. The temperature that week had been severe, dropping to 20 below zero at night. According to the thermometer, Amos kept outside his own cabin, but 20 below was not unprecedented in these mountains. Old-timers talked about winters in the 1880s when cold had lasted for weeks. Mountain families had survived those winters. Why had Henry not survived this one? Amos walked around the small cabin interior, examining everything with the careful attention he usually reserved for tracking deer. The walls were chinked adequately. The door fitted tightly in its frame. The single window was shuttered from inside. Henry had done everything right according to standard mountain practice. He had built a fire. He had sealed his cabin against drafts. He had wrapped himself in blankets, and he had died anyway. The realization came slowly as Amos studied the fireplace. Heat rose. That was a fundamental truth everyone knew. Fire created heat, and heat went upward, pulled by the same draft that drew smoke up the chimney. Henry's fireplace had functioned exactly as designed. It had pulled cold air from the cabin floor, heated that air, and sent it straight up the chimney into the night sky. The process was efficient and continuous. The fireplace had burned steadily, consuming wood and producing heat that immediately escaped through the very structure designed to contain fire safely. Henry had not died from lack of fire. He had died because his fireplace was, in its fundamental design, a system for removing heat from his cabin rather than retaining it. Amos buried Henry on a hillside overlooking Kettle Ridge 4 days after finding him. The ground was frozen 18 inches deep, and digging the grave required building fires on the burial spot for 2 full days to thaw the earth enough for a shovel to penetrate. 6 neighbors came for the service. Doc Raymond Pierce said words over the grave. Eliza Dalton, Henry's widow who lived with her sister in the valley, wept quietly. Everyone attributed Henry's death to the harsh winter and his age. He had been 63, old enough that cold could take a man. Amos said nothing during the service, but he could not stop thinking about the fireplace still burning when he found Henry's body. That detail gnawed at him through the funeral and during the walk back to his own cabin. A fire had been burning, heat had been present, yet Henry had frozen. The logic did not align. Over the following weeks, Amos visited every cabin within walking distance of his homestead. He told neighbors he was checking on them after Henry's death, making sure everyone had survived the cold spell. This was true, but not complete. What Amos was actually doing was studying fireplaces. Carl Meadows lived 5 miles north in a cabin he had built the previous summer. His fireplace was new, constructed from river stones mortared with clay. Amos examined it carefully, noting how the firebox was deep and the chimney was wide. Carl was proud of his work. He explained that a wide chimney drew smoke efficiently, preventing the cabin from filling with fumes. Amos nodded and asked how much wood Carl burned during cold nights. The answer was substantial. Carl estimated he burned a full cord every 10 days when temperatures dropped below freezing. Walter Grimes lived 8 miles west in a cabin that had stood for 20 years. His fireplace was traditional Appalachian construction, field stones stacked without mortar, the gaps chinked with mud. Walter burned even more wood than Carl, rising 3 times each night to feed logs into the fire. If he let the fire die, the cabin temperature dropped to near freezing within 2 hours. Frank Jessup had the most sophisticated fireplace Amos encountered. Frank had paid a mason from Asheville to build it 5 years earlier, spending money most mountain families would never see in a lifetime. The fireplace had a proper damper, a smoke shelf, and carefully angled sides designed to reflect heat into the room. It was beautiful and functional. It also consumed enormous quantities of wood and required constant attention. Amos found the pattern consistent across every cabin he visited. Fireplaces were hungry, inefficient, and demanded continuous feeding. They heated the air immediately in front of them while leaving cabin corners cold. They required someone to wake multiple times during bitter nights to add fuel. And despite burning massive amounts of wood, they barely kept mountain families alive during the worst cold. The flaw was universal, built into the fundamental design that every mountaineer accepted without question. Fire heated air, hot air rose. Chimneys pulled that hot air out of cabins and released it into the sky. Families were burning wood to heat the outside. Amos spent March of 1951 thinking about heat, not fire, but heat itself. Fire was the source, but heat was the thing that kept people alive. He began to understand there was a difference between creating heat and retaining it. Every fireplace he had examined created heat efficiently. None of them retained it. He was not an educated man. He had attended school through 6th grade before his father needed him full-time for farm work. He knew basic arithmetic and could read well enough to handle a Bible or an almanac. But he had never studied physics or engineering. What he did have was a lifetime of observing how the natural world worked and a mind that noticed patterns others missed. In early April, when the snow had melted and the creeks ran high with runoff, Amos walked down to the Pigeon River that flowed through the valley below his cabin. He was ostensibly checking his small fish traps, but his real purpose was to study the stones. The riverbed was full of them, worn smooth by centuries of water flow. Some were round, but many were flat, shaped like irregular plates ranging from the size of a man's hand to pieces as large as a shovel blade. Amos sat on the riverbank for most of that afternoon, watching how sunlight warmed the exposed stones. By midday, the flat rocks were hot enough that he could barely touch them. He noticed something interesting. The round stones cooled quickly when clouds blocked the sun. The flat stones stayed warm much longer. He pressed his palm against a large flat stone that had been shaded for 10 minutes. It still held significant heat. He returned the next day and conducted a simple experiment. He built a small fire on the riverbank using dry wood he had brought from his cabin. He placed 3 stones near the fire. One was round and smooth, one was flat and broad, one was irregular and jagged. He let the fire burn for an hour, heating all 3 stones equally. Then he scattered the fire and waited. The irregular stone cooled to touchable temperature within 20 minutes. The round stone took 30 minutes. The flat stone remained too hot to hold comfortably for more than an hour. Amos repeated this experiment 3 times over the following week with different stones. The result was consistent. Flat stones with broad surface area retained heat far longer than other shapes. He began carrying flat river stones back to his cabin, selecting pieces that were uniform in thickness and large enough to be useful. His neighbors saw him hauling stones up the mountain and assumed he was planning to build something, perhaps a new chimney or a smokehouse. Amos did not correct their assumptions. He was not entirely sure himself what he was planning. He only knew that flat stones held heat, and holding heat was the problem every mountain cabin failed to solve. By late April, he had gathered nearly 200 flat stones, stacked in careful piles near his cabin. Amos began construction on May 3, 1951. He chose a location 15 feet from his cabin's east wall on level ground where drainage was good. His neighbors, if they had been watching, would have expected him to dig a foundation for a spring house or perhaps a root cellar. Instead, Amos dug a trench that was long and narrow, 8 feet in length and only 3 feet wide, excavating down 12 inches to reach undisturbed soil below the topsoil and root layer. He filled the trench bottom with gravel hauled from the creek, creating drainage and a level base. On top of the gravel, he began laying his flat river stones, setting them horizontally in the most stable configuration. The first layer formed the floor of what would become his tunnel. He used clay mixed with sand as mortar between stones, packing it carefully to create a smooth, continuous surface. Carl Meadows stopped by on the 4th day of construction. He watched Amos working for several minutes before speaking. "What are you building there, Amos?" The question was casual, but carried an undertone of skepticism. Amos did not look up from his work. "A heating system," he replied. Carl walked closer, examining the low stone structure that was beginning to take shape. "It looks like a root cellar laying on its side," Carl said. "How's that supposed to heat anything?" Amos explained his theory. Standard fireplaces sent heat up and out. He was building a system that would keep heat low and push it horizontally through stone that would hold warmth for hours. The fire would burn inside a stone tunnel, heating the stones themselves, and those stones would radiate heat long after the fire died down. Carl listened, then shook his head slowly. "Heat rises, Amos. That's just nature. You can't fight nature." He left without saying goodbye. Word spread through the mountain community that Amos Caudle was building something strange. Walter Grimes rode over the following week, curious to see what the talk was about. By then, Amos had completed the floor and was building the walls. He was constructing 2 walls simultaneously, one inner and one outer, with a 4-inch gap between them. The inner wall would contain the fire and direct heat. The outer wall would insulate and protect. Both walls were built from flat stones laid horizontally, creating smooth surfaces that would conduct and radiate heat efficiently. Walter studied the construction with the critical eye of someone who had built structures for 40 years. "That gap between your walls is wasted space," he observed. "You are making this twice as hard, as it needs to be." Amos paused in his work, wiping sweat from his forehead. "The gap keeps the outer wall from losing heat too fast," he explained. "It is like wearing 2 shirts instead of 1 in winter." Walter grunted, unconvinced. "Seems like a lot of work for something that probably will not work at all," he said. Amos returned to laying stones. He had expected skepticism. Mountain people trusted methods that had been proven over generations. What he was building had never been tried. The construction consumed Amos's spring and early summer. He worked methodically, refusing to rush despite the skepticism from neighbors who stopped by to watch his progress. Each stone was selected for specific characteristics. Thickness needed to be consistent, between 2 and 3 inches. Surface area needed to be substantial, providing maximum contact with adjacent stones. Edges needed to be relatively straight, allowing tight fitting that minimized gaps requiring mortar. Amos rejected roughly 1 stone for every 3 he placed. The rejected stones were set aside in a separate pile. He would use them later for less critical applications, but the tunnel walls themselves demanded perfection. The horizontal layering technique required patience. Each stone was placed, tested for stability, adjusted if necessary, and mortared only when Amos was satisfied with its position. The mortar he used was not simple mud. He had developed a mixture of clay, sand, and lime that he obtained by burning limestone rocks in a hot fire for several hours, then crushing the resulting material into powder. The inner wall rose slowly, course by course. When it reached 2 feet in height, Amos began the outer wall, maintaining the 4-inch gap with careful spacing. Every 5th course, he placed small flat stones spanning the gap, connecting inner and outer walls to ensure structural integrity while maintaining the insulating airspace. The technique was time-consuming but necessary. Without these connecting stones, the 2 walls would be independent and unstable. By mid-June, the walls had reached their full height of 2.5 feet. The tunnel opening at one end was 2 feet wide and 2 feet tall, sized to allow firewood feeding while remaining small enough to concentrate heat. The opposite end of the tunnel was closed with carefully fitted stones, creating a dead end where heat would accumulate and radiate outward through the stone mass. The timber roofing presented a different challenge. Amos needed a roof that was strong enough to support soil insulation and potential snow load, but he could not allow the timbers to rest directly on the heated stone walls. Wood in direct contact with hot stone would char and eventually fail. His solution was to create a gap. He selected 4 oak logs, each 6 inches in diameter and 10 feet long. He shaped flat surfaces on opposite sides of each log using a draw knife, creating beams with 2 parallel flat faces. These beams rested on stone supports he had built at each end of the tunnel, positioned 6 inches above the wall tops. The beams ran parallel to the tunnel length, spanning from front to back. Across these primary beams, Amos laid smaller split logs perpendicular, creating a roof frame. Over this frame, he placed a layer of bark, then a thick coating of the same clay mixture he had used for mortar, and finally a layer of soil that would grow grass and provide living insulation. The completed structure looked strange. It was low, barely 3 feet tall. It stretched 8 feet long and 4 feet wide. It resembled no fireplace or heating system anyone in the region had ever seen. Amos finished construction on July 23, 1951. He spent the following week allowing the mortar and clay to cure completely, checking daily for cracks or settling. The structure remained solid. On August 1st, with the summer heat making any fire seem unnecessary, Amos prepared to test his system for the first time. He had connected the tunnel to his cabin through a modification he had made to the cabin's east wall. He had removed one section of the log wall at floor level and built a stone channel that ran from the tunnel's closed end directly under his cabin floor. The channel was lined with flat stones and allowed heat from the tunnel to radiate upward through the cabin floorboards. The opening was small enough that he could seal it with a fitted stone panel if the system failed, restoring his cabin wall to its original configuration. Ruth Caudle, his wife of 12 years, watched from the cabin doorway as Amos knelt at the tunnel entrance with kindling and split oak. She had said little during the months of construction, trusting her husband's judgment even when neighbors called him foolish. But she was practical enough to worry. "If this does not work," she said quietly, "you will need to build a proper fireplace before winter comes." Amos nodded. He knew the stakes. He had invested 4 months of labor into an untested theory. If the tunnel failed, he would have wasted the entire growing season that he should have spent on other preparations. He arranged kindling in the tunnel entrance, using dry pine bark and small twigs. He struck his flint and steel, coaxing a flame from charcloth, nurturing it until the kindling caught. Small flames grew, and he added slightly larger pieces of wood. The tunnel drew air efficiently. The flames leaned inward, pulled by the draft created by the tunnel's design. Smoke flowed smoothly toward the back of the tunnel where Amos had built a small chimney that vented above ground level. Within 15 minutes, he had a sustained fire burning 2 feet inside the tunnel. He added split oak, pieces about 8 inches long and 3 inches thick, sized specifically for the tunnel's dimensions. The stone walls began to warm. Amos placed his hand on the outer wall surface. Heat was transferring through the stone mass, warming the exterior, even though the fire burned inside the inner wall. He walked to his cabin and lay his hand on the floor, near where the stone channel entered. Nothing yet. It was too soon. Heat needed time to saturate the stone mass before it would radiate into the cabin. He maintained the fire for 2 hours, feeding wood at regular intervals. The tunnel consumed far less fuel than a fireplace would have required. By mid-afternoon, the cabin floor above the stone channel was noticeably warm. Ruth knelt and pressed both palms against the boards. "Amos," she said, her voice carrying surprise, "the floor is almost too hot to touch. Come, feel this." The first real test came in December of 1951. A cold front moved through the mountains, dropping temperatures to 15 below zero. Amos woke at dawn to find frost patterns on the inside of his window and his water bucket frozen solid. He walked outside to check the thermometer mounted on the cabin's north wall. 15 below, the kind of cold that killed livestock and made breathing painful. He fed the tunnel at sunrise, using split hickory that burned hot and slow. Within an hour, the cabin interior was comfortable enough that Ruth could work at her loom without wearing her heavy coat. Amos burned approximately 8 pieces of wood during the entire day, feeding the tunnel once in the morning and once in the evening. The stone mass held heat so efficiently that the cabin remained warm throughout the night without any additional fuel. 2 days later, Carl Meadows appeared at Amos's door, his face red from cold and exertion. He had walked the 5 miles from his cabin, and his first words were a question. "How much wood are you burning?" Amos invited him inside, noting how Carl immediately moved toward the warmth radiating from the floor. "I burned maybe 10 pieces yesterday," Amos replied. Carl stared at him. 10 pieces? "I burned half a cord yesterday, and still woke up freezing 3 times during the night." Amos showed Carl the tunnel, explaining how the heated stone mass radiated warmth for hours after the fire died down. Carl walked around the structure, examining it from every angle. He knelt and placed his hand on the outer wall. The stones were warm to the touch even though no smoke came from the small chimney, indicating the fire had died down. "This does not make sense," Carl said, but he was no longer speaking with skepticism. He was speaking with the confusion of someone whose understanding of how things worked had just been challenged. Word spread more quickly after that visit. Walter Grimes came to see the tunnel in late December. Frank Jessup brought his 2 grown sons in early January. Each visitor touched the warm stones, felt the heated cabin floor, and asked the same questions. How did Amos think of this? Could it be built using different materials? Would it work on sloped ground? Amos answered every question patiently, explaining the principles as he understood them. Heat stored in stone mass. Heat radiating from large surface area. Heat concentrated low rather than rising to escape through a chimney. The old-timers remained skeptical despite the evidence. Walter Grimes admitted the system worked but maintained it was too complicated for most people to build. The younger men were more interested. Frank Jessup asked if he could measure Amos's tunnel, taking careful notes about dimensions and construction methods. Amos agreed willingly. He had no interest in keeping secrets. If others could benefit from what he had learned, that seemed only right. But the real test was still coming. The winter of 1951 had been cold. The winter of 1952 would be legendary. The cold came in January of 1952 with a ferocity that no one living had experienced. The temperature dropped below zero on January 10th and stayed there for 12 consecutive days. By January 15th, Amos's thermometer registered 40 below zero at dawn. The mercury was barely visible in the bottom of the glass tube. Wood split with sounds like rifle shots when struck with an axe. Metal tools became dangerous to touch with bare hands. Livestock died in barns despite being sheltered. Amos woke before dawn on that coldest morning and immediately checked the cabin interior. Ruth was sleeping peacefully under a single quilt. He could see his breath, but barely. The cabin was cold by summer standards, but survivable without discomfort. He dressed and went outside to feed the tunnel. The firewood he had stacked near the tunnel entrance was frozen solid, covered in thick frost. He loaded the tunnel with split oak and hickory, using his smallest pieces as kindling because the cold made larger wood difficult to ignite. The fire started reluctantly but built strength as the tunnel's draft pulled air through. Within 30 minutes, flames were visible deep in the stone channel. Amos returned to the cabin and prepared breakfast while Ruth woke. She moved about without her coat, wearing only her wool dress. The floor was warm beneath her feet. They ate cornmeal mush and drank coffee, neither of them speaking about the extraordinary cold outside. The tunnel was working exactly as designed. 3 miles down the mountain, families were fighting for their lives. Carl Meadows burned every piece of furniture he could spare, feeding his fireplace continuously while his wife and children huddled under every blanket they owned. The fireplace consumed wood at a terrifying rate, and still the cabin interior temperature hovered barely above freezing. Walter Grimes fared slightly better only because his cabin was smaller and easier to heat, but he exhausted his prepared firewood supply and had to venture outside in dangerous cold to split more from his reserves. Frank Jessup made a decision on January 16th. He bundled his family in their warmest clothes, loaded them on a sled pulled by his horse, and made the dangerous journey to the valley town where his brother lived. The risk of travel in 40 below cold was substantial, but Frank judged it safer than remaining in a cabin his fireplace could not adequately heat. They made it safely, but the journey took 6 hours that should have required 3, and the horse nearly died from the exertion. Doc Raymond Pierce later documented that 14 people in the surrounding counties died during the cold snap of 1952. Most were elderly, but 3 were children who froze in cabins where fireplaces had burned all night without providing adequate heat. The death toll would have been higher if families had not made desperate decisions to evacuate or crowd multiple households together in the largest available cabins. Amos burned less than a cord of wood during those 12 days. His tunnel worked perfectly. Frank Jessup appeared at Amos's cabin on February 3, 1952, 3 weeks after the cold snap had ended. He arrived with paper, a pencil, and a measuring tape. Amos was splitting wood when Frank walked up the trail. Frank did not waste time with pleasantries. "I want to build one of these tunnels before next winter," he said. "Will you teach me how?" Amos set down his axe and nodded. They spent the entire day examining the tunnel structure. Amos explained every detail, starting with site selection and drainage considerations. The tunnel needed to be positioned where water would not pool during heavy rain. It needed to be close enough to the cabin to connect efficiently, but far enough away that any structural failure would not threaten the main dwelling. Frank took notes constantly, sketching diagrams and recording measurements. The inner wall and outer wall dimensions, the 4-inch gap between walls, the size of the tunnel opening, the length of the combustion chamber, the position and size of the chimney, the composition of the mortar mixture, the spacing of the connecting stones that bridged the gap between walls. Every element was documented, carefully. They discussed stone selection. Frank asked whether round river stones would work if flat ones were not available. Amos explained that flat stones were essential. Round stones could not be stacked in stable horizontal layers. They would shift and settle, creating gaps that would leak heat and compromise the structure. Flat stones distributed weight evenly and created the large surface area necessary for effective heat radiation. The timber roofing presented questions. Frank wanted to know if he could use chestnut instead of oak. Amos saw no reason why not, as long as the timbers were sound and properly sized. The key was maintaining the gap between roof timbers and stone walls to prevent charring. Frank asked about insulation depth. Amos recommended at least 6 inches of soil over the roof structure, more if possible, creating both thermal mass and protection against weather. Ruth brought them lunch at midday, and they ate while discussing the stone channel that connected the tunnel to the cabin interior. This was the most complex part of the system. The channel had to be built carefully to prevent smoke from entering the cabin while allowing heat to radiate upward. Amos showed Frank how he had constructed a slight upward slope from the tunnel toward the cabin, allowing heat to rise naturally while preventing smoke from traveling backward. By late afternoon, Frank had filled 8 pages with notes and sketches. He stood and shook Amos's hand. "I am starting this in March," he said, "soon as the ground thaws enough to dig." Amos nodded. "If you need help with anything, come find me." Frank thanked him and started down the trail toward home. Before he disappeared into the trees, he turned back. "You saved my family, Amos. That tunnel of yours kept you alive when my fireplace nearly killed us. I will not forget that." Frank Jessup completed his fire tunnel in late May of 1952. He built it following Amos's specifications exactly, spending 6 weeks on construction. When winter returned, his family stayed warm while burning half the wood they had consumed the previous year. Frank's neighbors noticed. By the spring of 1953, 4 more families in the surrounding valleys were building fire tunnels. The design spread organically, passed from neighbor to neighbor through demonstration rather than promotion. Amos never sought recognition for his innovation. He continued living quietly on his mountain homestead, trapping, hunting, and maintaining his small farm. Ruth bore 2 children during the 1950s, and Amos built additions to his cabin to accommodate his growing family. Each addition incorporated the fire tunnel principle, creating a home that was warmer and more efficient than any traditional mountain dwelling. Carl Meadows built a fire tunnel in 1954 after his 3rd consecutive winter of burning unsustainable quantities of firewood. He never explicitly admitted that Amos had been right, and he had been wrong, but he stopped making jokes about Amos's strange construction methods. Walter Grimes died in 1957 without ever building a tunnel himself, but his son built one the following year and later told people that his father had privately acknowledged Amos's genius during his final winter. Doc Raymond Pierce documented the spread of fire tunnel construction in his personal journals. By 1960, he estimated that more than 30 families in the region had built variations of Amos's design. The death rate from winter cold dropped noticeably during severe winters. Families that once struggled to survive cold snaps remained comfortable. The innovation was particularly valuable for elderly residents and families with young children, populations most vulnerable to inadequate heating. The technical variations were interesting. Some builders created longer tunnels, extending them to 15 or 20 feet to heat larger cabins. Others experimented with multiple tunnels feeding from a single firebox. A few incorporated the tunnel design into new cabin construction, building the stone channel directly into the foundation. Each variation maintained the core principles Amos had discovered: flat stone construction, dual wall insulation, horizontal heat distribution, and thermal mass storage. Amos Caudle died in 1978 at the age of 71. His obituary in the county newspaper mentioned that he had been a trapper, farmer, and respected member of the mountain community. It made no reference to fire tunnels or heating innovations. His family buried him in the small cemetery overlooking the valley where he had lived his entire adult life. But the tunnels remained. Into the 1980s and 90s, cabins throughout the Appalachian region still used fire tunnel systems built decades earlier. Some had been maintained by multiple generations of families. Others were discovered by new property owners who recognized the sophisticated engineering, even if they did not initially understand the purpose. The stone structures endured, silent testimony to the power of observation, persistence, and one mountaineer's refusal to accept that freezing to death beside a burning fire was inevitable.